Hi again, everyone. Welcome to another particular live webinar. I'm Daniel Marbach. Today, my colleague Bob Langley and I are joined by Matt Snider, Principal Program Manager for ServiceFabric. He's worked on ServiceFabric for 7 years and was the first technical PM to join the team when it was founded. We doubt there will be anyone more capable of presenting this topic. Of course, no offense meant to anyone listening in this call. We've already received a few questions from people in advance, but if you have questions during Matt's presentation, please use the Q&A feature of this webinar at any time to add your question. We'll answer them as we see fit at the end of the webinar. So Matt, let's get started.
Hi, I'm Matt Snider. I've been on ServiceFabric for some time, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to present a little bit about it to you folks and hopefully take some of your questions and then, introduce you to some of the other aspects of the ServiceFabric community. So for those of you who might not have heard of ServiceFabric before, what the heck is this thing? ServiceFabric is a large distributed services platform that we built inside of Microsoft really to help us run many internal Microsoft services. So ServiceFabric has been around for about 8 to 10 years, depending upon how you measure these things inside Microsoft. And it's used for a bunch of things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But fundamentally, it's a big platform for building new applications or services, getting those applications deployed, upgrading them, managing them, and then actually operating those large distributed services at basically arbitrary scale, whatever you want. When I say it's widely used inside of Microsoft, this hopefully gives you some sense of that. We're underneath a lot of different services. Some of these you've probably used before. Some of them you might not even know you're using. But ServiceFabric is underneath all of them, providing that core reliable distributed systems architecture and platform. And all of these things are our customers. So the number that I like to point out is, about 30% of Azure's cores, all of Azure's actual hardware, basically run ServiceFabric directly. And what's interesting about that is you go, well, Matt, what about the other 70%? Well, some of these other Azure resource providers in Azure, the services that stand up your VMs or stand up your networks or provision your storage, those services run on top of ServiceFabric. So there's no need for, a single VM to run on top of ServiceFabric. That doesn't mean anything, or we can't do much to help there. But the service that stands up and monitors and deploys and manages the lifecycle of that VM, that's a ServiceFabric service, because those are the ones that have to scale. Those are the ones that Microsoft cares deeply about, the high availability and reliability of that service. So even though we're only running on about a third of Azure, we help provision and stand up the rest. We're integral to a lot of these technologies. So, not just Microsoft. There's a whole bunch of other customers out there who use ServiceFabric, and we've got everything from big hardware and software manufacturers to smaller firms, startups. And what's interesting about ServiceFabric is that we're really useful in both of these types of environments. One of our customers said, "Hey, I really enjoy ServiceFabric because it saves me from having to write all that defensive code and having to think and learn about all these different types of problems that I could have. ServiceFabric is just there for me and provides that as a baseline and lets me focus on my application." So we see it being used more and more by just a wide spectrum of things. We got everything from online gaming to manufacturing. And part of the reason that we see that breadth of adoption is that there's really a bunch of different scenarios where ServiceFabric makes sense. These are just some of them. You might be trying to figure out how to migrate a bunch of your existing software to a cloud environment. You're lifting and shifting is the phrase, right? Where you're picking up an existing application and you don't really want to change it just yet, but you do need to get it into a different environment because you want to get off your own hardware, or you want to migrate between cloud providers or something like that. I think core to ServiceFabric's mission is that we are the tier 1 mission critical business platform for Microsoft services for a lot of cases, and that all that learning, all of those capabilities are things that we provide to you. We see a lot of people building IoT or data streaming, data processing applications on top of ServiceFabric. We see people building lots of low latency data processing applications, and that actually includes things like games, where you need that responsiveness and you need that quick response just in case anything bad happens in the environment. You don't want to lose your information. And of course, things that are greenfield, things that are entirely new cloud-based applications, stuff that, a few years ago, we wouldn't have thought that most people would be interested in building or want to build or even be able to build. We see more and more of those coming away where industries get disrupted and things that we thought, were previously the domain of maybe brick and mortar are now moving into the cloud. The point of that ServiceFabric is that we're used in all of these scenarios, and it's a single platform that works pretty much regardless of what type of workload you need to run. So if you need to run a bunch of containers, you can do that with ServiceFabric. If you need to run a bunch of new stateless microservices, you can do that with ServiceFabric. If you need to run those workloads on Linux, you can do that with ServiceFabric. If you need to run all of these things kind of together, where you have some older lift and shift type applications and some new microservices, and you want to run them in one environment, ServiceFabric is good for that. And that's actually a big differentiator, because we see in some cases that there are other platforms out there that are only good in kind of one of these particular verticals or one of these situations. And if you wanted to have, say, some containers, but then also wanted to have a bunch of little microservices, that you'd have to have two entirely different platforms in order to do that. And with ServiceFabric, that's not true. You get this one integrated environment with a great experience wrapped around it, and you can basically do whatever you want inside of it. We talked a little bit about, the microservices versus monoliths thing, and that's really, I don't like that as a dichotomy. I don't like that as a binary choice. For me, it's much more of a bunch of different stages, and you might be starting with some traditional app. You just want to pick it up and throw it into some hosting environment and say, keep that running, keep 5 instances of that running, scale it in, scale it out, help me manage upgrades, help me monitor that thing, but fundamentally I'm not changing it at this point in time. ServiceFabric is great for that type of scenario. We have 2 kind of different models. If you're going down the container route, we can host your Linux or Windows containers, no problem. Containerization is a process and technical overhead for some workloads where they don't need, maybe the dependency management isn't so big a deal, or you're not worried about untrusted third-party code or leaking resources or stuff like that. So maybe you just want to pick up that exe or that executable package as it is, and just deploy that. ServiceFabric supports both of these. But what we typically see after you've deployed this existing code base is that something needs to change. Either steps 3 and 4 are kind of about, maybe you need some new services stood up alongside that application, where you want to add some new feature or put in a cache or something like that. We can do that, and again, you can do that all in the same environment. You can also sometimes break that monolith apart, where you've got a part that was written, say, in language X, and you wanted to translate that part into language Y because language Y has more tools and is better suited to that particular problem. Maybe you found a performance critical area and you want to take that out of the existing monolith and really restructure it and be able to iterate in order to drive that part's performance and be able to scale and update it independently of the rest of the monolith. Very rarely for existing code, it dissolves entirely into a bunch of little micros. Sometimes when you write a greenfield thing from scratch, you start at stage 5, which is actually kind of interesting. But it really doesn't matter to ServiceFabric. You can mix and match and use all of these different patterns all at the same time, really whatever makes the most sense to you and your workload. When we talk about ServiceFabric, there's a lot of things that ServiceFabric provides. Again, it's a very broad platform because we've been using it inside of Microsoft for so long, and also we built so many different types of applications on top of ServiceFabric inside, that we really had to build a breadth of features and capabilities in order to support all those different types of workloads. One of the neatest things about ServiceFabric, though, is that we'll get into all these nice little features and capabilities that the platform actually gives you. But one of the first things that it gives you is flexibility in terms of where you actually run and deploy your application. So ServiceFabric can run basically anywhere that you choose. I'm running it right now, as we'll see in a minute, on my local laptop. I've got a little 5-node cluster running. Of course, we run well in Azure, but you can also take ServiceFabric and deploy it for free on-prem. You could have your own virtual or physical hardware and deploy a ServiceFabric cluster and run things there. And you could, in fact, deploy it in other clouds. ServiceFabric has actually live, customers running on top of AWS, which is a bit of a weird world from, where Microsoft probably thought it was going to be a decade ago, but nevertheless, there it is. And we do this because we really want that flexibility. I want to be able to debug, develop, really kick the tires and make sure that things are working well on my local machine before I ever go and spin up cloud resources or resources in my data centers in order to actually, test this thing. That's whatever code I'm writing. And the cloud pricing wars are a real thing. And so maybe tomorrow, if you're in AWS and Azure drops its prices, maybe some of those workloads start to look more enticing to come run on Azure or the other way around. And you don't really want to have to throw all your code out and start from scratch when these types of things happen, right? I don't want to have a low fidelity development environment where I don't really know what's going to happen or what the real environment is going to look like. And I don't really want to have to be stuck in one place or another. I want to be able to migrate between on-prem, where maybe some of my workloads have to run for legal or policy reasons, in the cloud. And so if you're writing a kind of, what we think of as a native ServiceFabric application that doesn't have a lot of dependencies on other stuff, that's really one of the key pieces of flexibility that ServiceFabric gives you. If you go in the Wayback Machine, not the Internet Archive Wayback Machine, but if you step into a little time machine and go back and look underneath some of the older versions of Link Server on-premise, or Skype for Business now, or Sklink, or whatever we're calling it, you actually, if you scratch the surface underneath that product, you find ServiceFabric. And that was because Microsoft needed to run Skype for Business as a hosted service in the cloud, and we also wanted to sell this box product that people could, deploy on-prem. And, nobody really wants to have two entirely different architectures, two entirely different platforms, and two entirely different code bases to handle those two different environments. So that was an example of one time that this portability really came in useful, and the Link team at the time was able to take good advantage of ServiceFabric to give them that flexibility. But let's talk about some of these actual capabilities in detail. So we talked a lot. ServiceFabric has a bunch of programming models and a bunch of tooling to really help you as a developer and me as a developer, write code and manage that code and figure out how it's going to work in a production environment. The two different programming models are really there's four, but there's reliable actors, which are stateful or stateful actors that you can scale out. There's reliable services. Now, the actors are actually built on top of the reliable services. And so if you don't need that single-threaded programming model, the reliable services are usually where we'd start you because they're more generic and they tend to get out of your way. The guest executables are, of course, as we mentioned, where you can bring existing code basically unmodified. You just package it up and give it to us. And containers are, if you have Windows or Linux containers, you can run those. The programming languages that we support first class today are .NET and Java. But there's also tons of support, especially in our management pipeline for REST, HTTP-based APIs, as well as PowerShell and Azure CLI. So if you're, want to script a development environment or want to script a deployment pipeline, that's stuff that you can absolutely do. And that is well supported. And we'll see a little bit about how ServiceFabric supports that and a bunch of other things that we'll get to in a minute. But basically, we have this rich management API exposed in a bunch of different ways that you can pick up and use kind of as you see fit for your DevOps scenarios. The next type of stuff that we talk about is, again, kind of more DevOps because now that you've deployed it, you have a little bit more to do. We talk a lot about orchestration. You might have heard of orchestration in the context of containers, but ServiceFabric can really orchestrate anything. Any of these, whether it's a container, a bare process, a microservice, whatever, ServiceFabric can handle that orchestration task. When we talk about lifecycle management, we're talking about, first of all, that automation via those APIs that we talked about, and also rolling upgrades. So ServiceFabric actually has a very rich set of upgrade policies that you can use to deploy new code. And I'll talk about that in just a second when we talk about how to monitor and diagnose things. Now, deploying a giant, multi-machine application sounds really cool until things start to go wrong. And then the question is, how do I know what's going wrong and how do I fix it? Well, the first thing is that ServiceFabric is already watching your processes, your applications, your services, your containers. And if anything really bad happens, they crash, they fall over, they start spitting out error codes. ServiceFabric is watching for that and will report those errors so that you can see them. They'll go into either our dashboard, which I'll show you in a minute, or the telemetry pipeline of your choice. And also, a time when those health warnings and events are particularly interesting are during those rolling upgrades. So say you package up a new version of your application and you say ServiceFabric, hey, please start rolling this out. We start rolling it out and the processes are crashing or something like that. ServiceFabric can notice that and can wait. We can see whether or not it's a transient issue, whether or not it's going to fix itself, or whether or not it's something intrinsic about the upgrade itself. And if there is something that doesn't resolve, that wasn't a transient little blip, ServiceFabric notices that and automatically rolls back to the prior version. We throw our hands up in the air and say, hey, that upgrade didn't work. Here was the error. Here's where it was. Figure out what that was or what caused that, and then we can try the upgrade again. So that's how we get these types of giant rolling upgrades where you really have a minimum of downtime, because ServiceFabric is orchestrating that upgrade, right? We're working with your application. We move workloads out of the nodes that we're going to upgrade. We upgrade the code, we bring the workloads back, and then we see if it stabilizes. If that doesn't work, if those health warnings and errors don't go away, then we put it back to the prior condition. ServiceFabric also has this notion of upgrade domains pretty tightly factored in. So you can basically define how many upgrade domains you want. The default in Azure is 5, but if you're setting up your own environments, you can do basically anything you want. And that's all that's going to get affected at a time. In ServiceFabric's application model, which I guess we should talk about over here a little bit, there's support for running many versions of your application side by side. So you can actually upgrade just one of those independently and see how it goes. And this is great for A/B testing and betaing certain features for customers and things like that. This also gets into kind of the rest of the health monitoring and the scale and the availability stuff that we talk about, because, well, first of all, we really want all these things to work. So scaling just looks a little bit like a different type of management operation, right? You just want more instances of your service stood up somewhere. And you may want to be able to scale in and scale out those workloads independently. And that all makes sense, and that's something that's well supported inside of ServiceFabric via some of those management APIs that we talked about. As we talked about recovery, right, there's a bunch of different reasons why things can fail. Nodes can fail, networks can fail, your code can fail, our code can fail, all sorts of things can go wrong. And that's where you really want that HA and availability that ServiceFabric provides, because it helps you not have to worry so much about what happens to your application in all of those different scenarios. Now, that said, we recommend you worry about what happens to all your services in those types of scenarios, just to make sure that they work well when these types of things are happening. And that's why we support what we call chaos and a bunch of other testing tools besides. In chaos, really, you can point it at a cluster, you can point it at a service and say, hey, put this thing through the ringer, like really try to exercise it, move it around, cause random failures, delay certain calls, all sorts of things that you'll see in production, but you might not necessarily see if you're running just on your dev box. So we give you a bunch of tools to, exercise your code to help define those things before you ever, do any sort of real deployment. In terms of monitoring and diagnostics, ServiceFabric does a lot of work, and we work with other teams at Microsoft to make sure that there's a lot of different diagnostic tools. ServiceFabric's main goal in this case is to make sure that you can bring whatever you want. You can use whatever monitoring and diagnostics that you deem fit or that you're familiar with using. We're not going to mandate a particular tool. That said, we do have really good integration, of course, with the rest of the Microsoft tools, particularly in Azure, where if you wanted to use App Insights and OMS, that's a pretty good story. Now, we also see a lot of people, OMS isn't really available, or App Insights isn't really available on-prem or in AWS or on your dev box, or you might not be willing to pay for that service, and that's fine. And that's why ServiceFabric provides a lot of great options and integration points with other monitoring and diagnostic providers. We see a lot of people actually having a lot of success with the Elasticsearch, Logstash, geez, tongue twister. Anyway, and we have a pretty good set of tools for working with that as well, where we can help you get hooked up. But the whole point of this is that, everything from the dev experience all the way to real production considerations, ServiceFabric is there. And you kind of need that sort of operational end-to-end view if services are really going to work particularly well in these types of environments. But don't just take my word for it. We've had this is kind of consolidated customer feedback from a bunch of surveys that we put out there. And basically, as a developer, and before I did this, I was a developer, so I can echo some of these things. One of the things that's really great, I think personally, is that consistency and that Visual Studio integration, so that I can get a good local environment running. I can do my work. I can validate my work. I can be pretty sure that I've kicked the tires and done all my testing locally before I ever have to, show things or deal with an integration environment. I can feel pretty confident in that these tools between Visual Studio and my local cluster and the chaos testing, I can feel good that that I've done my work and that I know that things are working well before I push things out into production. I like the choice of languages, and hopefully we'll get more than just .NET and Java in the future. There's some work going on that's enabling that. And I also like that ServiceFabric has open sourced the programming model. So unfortunately not the whole core of the platform yet. We're working on that. Turns out when you've been building software inside of Microsoft for like a decade, it's a little bit tied up with a bunch of internal Microsoft goop. And we're working to untangle some of that goop and publish the whole platform as a open source project. But it's taking a little longer, I think, than we thought it was going to happen. But at least the program model, the top level APIs that I interact with, those are all open source. And I can go look at them and poke around and see how they work. All right. The next thing that ServiceFabric we see being pretty powerful for is DevOps, particularly around the rolling upgrades that I mentioned and the kind of automated deployment. And whether that, ServiceFabric provides a lot of APIs for doing deployments and managing them, thinking about them, monitoring them, that sort of stuff. So, there's VSTS, Visual Studio Team Services, that has some really good, tasks and integration with ServiceFabric to package up your services and deploy them and version them and all that good stuff. But they're just using the same APIs that ServiceFabric provides to everybody, which means that if you wanted to use Jenkins or TeamCity or Circle CI or whatever, there's a bunch of other great integration points where these other CI/CD pipelines and build deployment systems can also be, taught to use ServiceFabric. And we actually see people having a lot of luck with wiring things up. In fact, a little while ago, I don't know if you guys have heard of Octopus Deploy, but Octopus Deploy did a big ServiceFabric integration. We worked with them to make sure that their tools worked well and that, adhered to guidelines and all that good stuff. But the whole point is that all those APIs are there and they're available, and you can basically do whatever you want. And I'll do some very super basic local DevOps-y stuff in a minute when I get to a demo. And there is a demo, I promise, and I will show code, I promise. ServiceFabric also really helps with managing the infrastructure, not in the sense that we're going to, provision operating systems or networks for you, but that we're going to help you deal with those types of changes and take advantage of those types of changes when they happen. So, for example, if your cluster is running hot, like there's a lot of resources and they're all getting consumed, that might trigger more operating systems, more OS instances getting provisioned. When those OSs get provisioned, you want to be able to use them, and you don't want to have that be a long, complicated process. Well, for example, in Azure, when those VMs come up, ServiceFabric is going to get installed on them. It's going to get configured. It's going to join the existing cluster, and then ServiceFabric is going to automatically distribute your workloads onto those new machines. And we have a bunch of types of controls to describe how that actually happens. ServiceFabric also ships a OS patch orchestration application, because OS patching is one of those things that on Patch Tuesday, if you're not careful, a whole bunch of your operating systems are going to reboot at the same time, and that might be bad for your running, actual service. So ServiceFabric intercepts those calls and helps you to control and monitor and really roll those types of changes out in your environment without disrupting your running actual production services. ServiceFabric, again, also has a bunch of, the theme of APIs is not going to get lost here. We have a lot of APIs to control this type of behavior, because fundamentally, ServiceFabric is a platform. We don't know all the situations that you or your ISV partners or whatever are going to be using ServiceFabric in. So we try to provide as many capabilities as possible, and then also try and provide guidance around, here are some common scenarios for how and when to use these capabilities kind of in this order. Health monitoring is another great example, right? We have APIs to get all this health information, and we have a bunch of policies that we have for ourselves, but you can fundamentally query it and then go display it or do whatever you want. One of the things that we promised we'd talk about is ServiceFabric's future, and I can't make PowerPoint slides, so that should show up there. We talked a little bit about what's next. And we should have done another. Did I miss something? Did I put this in the wrong order? I did put this wrong order. Well, I'll undo the PowerPoint and show you the slide that I meant to have there. What's coming up next is really better support for containers. We're looking to put the API models that ServiceFabric ships inside containers, let you run your microservices inside containers. Today, containers are for bulkier, larger things. We really want to make that a little bit more dynamic. We're doing support for a first-class ServiceFabric aware volume driver so that your container can have persisted state that doesn't even have to leave the cluster. And we're working on improving support for logging and monitoring of your container objects. We're also working on improved networking support within the cluster so that you can get kind of either, you can think of it as tiny little VNets, private networks basically per ServiceFabric application instance. And you can get stable IPs that as the workloads migrate around in your cluster, their IPs follow them. That might be only for containers, at least at first, until we figure out how viable or useful it is for other microservices. Typically, other microservices don't have that type of requirement, but we'll see what we get there. We're doing improvements around management capabilities. So we have this thing called resource governance, which is around rate limiting. So you can limit IOPS, you can limit the amount of memory that a workload consumes, you can limit the amount of disk that a workload consumes. And we're working on getting that better integrated with the rest of what we call cluster resource management in ServiceFabric. And of course, we're always working on debugging improvements where we realize there's a class of errors where your service might not start up correctly, or in this particular case, there's a particular error that doesn't get surfaced well. And so we want to always make sure that those are easier to see, easier to diagnose, and easier to debug. And the last thing is we're always working on simplification, which is taking our existing kind of APIs, trying to preserve as much of the power of the platform as possible, but make those APIs simpler and simpler. And I'll show you an example of what our APIs look like today in just a second. And of course, we'd be total idiots not to be thinking about some sort of serverless or full PaaS solution today. Today, ServiceFabric is kind of this weird blend in a lot of situations because we don't control the operating systems that we get deployed on top of. So it's a platform for your application. Gartner would put it in the application PaaS category, but you still have to do some infrastructure work in order to get ServiceFabric and in order to interact with your application. And we're trying to figure out how to take that away so that you don't have to do that work, because frankly, it's a large source of complexity and it's a large source of errors that actually end up impacting your services. So we're pretty sure that we know how to, roll out OS updates and things like that. We should just take that work. We should do that for you. And that's something that's kind of next on ServiceFabric. I'll come back to resources more at the end, but let me show you that slide that I somehow left hidden because I don't know how to work PowerPoint. That's just this right here. I was going to talk about some things that we've done recently. So in the last 6 months or so, we've GA'd support for Windows containers. We've GA'd support for ServiceFabric running entirely on Linux. We've GA'd some integration with Azure API management, which helps get traffic in and out of your ServiceFabric clusters. We've added resource governance, not just for containers, but for bare processes as well. We added a DNS service into the cluster that helps you, locate and communicate with your services. And then we've previewed support for .NET Core and really .NET Standard 2 and Java support. So there's more work coming there as the Linux side of the fence comes along, and those worlds themselves needed to stabilize a little. So I'll leave that there. Good. I'll take it briefly over to a demo so you can see what a little bit of this looks like. So this is kind of a ServiceFabric dashboard. This is called the ServiceFabric Explorer. This is built into the cluster, so you can see I'm just hitting my local cluster, and I'm able to see basically everything that's going on in this cluster. And I just have a little sample app deployed here, which is our voting app. The voting sample looks pretty much like a voting sample. I've entered 2 foods. Clearly, bacon is the right answer. So I'm going to upvote bacon, and I hit this breakpoint. This is that Visual Studio integration that I deployed this application to my local cluster just from F5 in Visual Studio. And we can see that what I'm running is basically a pretty standard ASP.NET Core web app. I've got two services, the web service, which is stateless, and it's drawing that UI. I've got my views here, right, which is what's drawing this, come on, Visual Studio, which is what's drawing this, this web page that we're looking at, right, pretty standard. And then when it gets a call, that's the main one, and it gets the call, it forwards the call via a built-in ServiceFabric proxy onto a data service, this is where the votes are actually getting tallied, and that's why I hit this breakpoint. So I'll let that continue, and we'll see, yep, the votes are 3 now. I'm going to destroy this breakpoint so I can go a little faster. But what's happening is that all of these are getting stored in what we call a reliable dictionary. And reliable dictionaries are one of the high-end programming models that ServiceFabric provides. And what this is actually doing is every single time it looks pretty much like a regular, concurrent dictionary, except that it's actually getting replicated. So when I put state inside of this collection, it's actually getting replicated inside of the cluster. And we can see those replicas. If I come over here, that's this, here's the data service, here's the web service again, and I've got 3 replicas of that stateful data. And if one of them were to die, ServiceFabric will take over and move it somewhere else and build a spare and go do all that good stuff. And that's, one of those programming models that ServiceFabric provides. It's not, not for everybody. Not everybody needs it, but it is a capability that ServiceFabric provides. Now let's see here. Which of these so let's do some of that, very light DevOps things. I'm a little bit limited because of port sharing on my local machine. But let's say that you weren't comfortable with 3 replicas of your stateful service being sufficient, right? You want your data to be safe. So you're going to go and change the target replica set size of that service to 5. So I've just, it's stateful, this is its name. I'm just going to update that service. And we come back in here, and what we'll see, takes a second for the UI to refresh, but ServiceFabric says, oh, I need 5 now, and it starts building spares, more secondaries. So these are going to get a copy of the state that's currently in the primary, and then they're going to go, march through a little life cycle thing. And then when they're caught up, they'll be active secondaries just like these other secondaries. And, the app is, if I can remember what window it's in, the app is, still up and responding to votes, right? No problem, right? And that's all happening kind of in parallel, right? So ServiceFabric didn't block these operations while we're building up more. And of course, maybe you go, wow, that, 5 copies of that state's actually really expensive and it's slowing my app down. So of course you can just go put things back, right? Oop, that was the connect one. There you go. And we'll drop some number of these, based on where we think they shouldn't be right now. Okay, so we've dropped those other spare replicas that we just built. And you can do this type of stuff all day. These are the same type of APIs that you'd see in a lot of other cases, and they're used for the same, yeah. This is just Visual Studio conveniently breaking when the processes break all, which is something I should turn off someday. So another thing is, there's all these management APIs where you can disable things. So in this case, we disabled node 0, and ServiceFabric going, well, that was where the primary was. That was doing all the work. And so I needed to migrate the primary to another place before I could successfully disable node 0. And so what we see is we flip the primary over, and things are still working. There's going to be a little lag because things have to re-resolve each other here. But those votes will get delivered to the new primary and replicated just the same as anything else. And of course, if I wanted to, I could bring that node back, but I'll just leave it there for now. There's no problem just leaving it there. Now, yeah, okay. So remember that health reporting I talked about. Now, the system services on my local machine are configured to have 5 replicas. And right now, because that node is disabled, there's only 4 replicas. And so various things are complaining that they don't have enough replicas to run correctly. So maybe I will reactivate that node so that my system services quit complaining. But that was an automatic health report. I didn't need to do anything for that to happen. And when I bring the node back, yep, it all coalesces and says, yep, actually I'm fine now. Everything's back at its targets. Everything is exactly the way it should be. Which is exactly what you want. You want those types of alerts and monitoring to be built in. So I think that's about all I have. Let me go to resources. So one of the things that, again, ServiceFabric is a large platform, so sometimes it's hard to know where to get started. So what we've got here is a bunch of quick starts. You can visit any of these, and I think we can probably share this deck afterwards. I'll talk with the guys and see if we can get this posted somewhere. But you can go to these. These are quick starts. The idea is you get started, you get going, and you can get something simple up and running in a few minutes. Really, for me, I go to WebPI, I download the latest ServiceFabric runtime and SDK tools. I clone one of our samples from GitHub and press F5, and that's pretty much all you really need to do. We also have a lot of additional resources. There's a lot of SDK documentation for all of our different API forms. There's kind of a hands-on lab thing that you can run through, and there's a bunch of different ways to get started. My personal favorite way to get started that I like telling people about is what we call the ServiceFabric party clusters. You can see here with a excellent, fully vetted, totally formal Microsoft logo that we put together. But what these are really free ServiceFabric clusters stood up in Azure. You don't need an Azure account. You don't need some special Microsoft sign-in or anything like that. You just grab the SDK, log in with your GitHub ID or I guess Facebook, and we give you access, we give you the connection information for a cluster running in Azure. And then you can play around with it. They reset each other every few hours. And it's kind of a playground where you can deploy our samples and play around with things without burning your own, MSDN credits or So that's another fun way that I love telling people about to get started. We have an active Stack Overflow environment. We have a forum, and we have a GitHub issues list where people can come and report issues, things that they're concerned about, things that don't seem to be working the way that they want. That's a great way to get involved with the team because the whole team watches these forums and is always trying to stay responsive and answer questions. Something else that's coming up, which is a convenient timing thing, is that this Thursday, the ServiceFabric team is having one of its regular Q&As. We have a monthly Q&A. They're about every third Thursday of the month, which happens to coincide with this coming Thursday. So there's a link to the ServiceFabric team blog, or if you just Google ServiceFabric team blog, you'll get there. In that blog post, there's a link to the Skype session to join. If you have, I'm going to answer some questions in a minute here, but if there are any more questions, or you're kicking the tires and just want to know where to go, or just want to see hang out with some other people and listen to us talk some more, community Q&As are a great way to get involved and to, get your questions answered or learn what other people are working on. And we have, we put out surveys there sometimes. We have customers demo some of their stuff sometimes. That's all what goes on in the community Q&A. So maybe you'll join us. We'd love to see you there. It's a pretty neat section. With that, let's see what we got for Q&As here. I know that there were a few. Oh, you guys have been answering questions for me. That's great. Wow. That's even easier. That's fantastic. Maybe just wait long enough, Danny. Will you guys answer all these questions?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, fantastic. I'll check you later. That'll be quick. But anyway, there were several questions. So as we can see, ServiceFabric is a little bit different from Service Bus. We do have a reliable data structure that is a concurrent queue, but a queue is very different from an actual messaging bus or messaging system. So we wouldn't say that those are the same at all. It would be a data structure that you might use to build such a thing, but it is not one itself. So clearly, ServiceFabric is a big platform where you would run something like Service Bus. In fact, Service Bus does run. Service Bus on-prem is run on ServiceFabric for years. But they're really many different things. So I hope that answers that question.
Matt, can I throw in some?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things we also like to talk about is that the reliable collections, they are really to store data inside a service, right? So if you want to expose like your own written message queue that is living inside a stateful service, then you actually have to provide an API that is consumable from outside of the service. You're actually interacting with that state over the service facade, so to speak, right?
Right, exactly. You have to put your own kind of API on top of those collections and figure out what primitives you want to expose. So like in the voting sample, right? In the voting sample, in the data controller, we saw that, right? There's a HTTP put this thing, right? Put vote data name was an API that we had to, create for this sample. And that's when it puts something or adds and updates it into that collection, right? If you wanted to call that something else, you could, but you have to go do this all yourself.
And we will be covering part of that in the next webinar on the 2nd November as well.
Yeah. Which I'd love to work on if you'll let me. Let's see here. So let's see what other questions we got. All right, more questions. So so in ServiceFabric, pretty much everything is an upgrade. Whether it's a bug fix, whether it's a new feature rollout, whether it's a config change, everything is an upgrade. They follow all the same patterns. What I can say is that it's good to test. There's some ways of testing upgrades locally, which if you did a couple. Yes, I'll stop debugging and we'll blow a bunch of things up. That's fine. There's examples of how to do upgrades built in here. And so normally you'd pick monitored in a real production environment, and then we give you a lot of policies for deciding what values to put in here. And there's actually this link will just take you directly to the upgrade documentation, which is over there. So normally we'd see rollback, and there's a bunch of other things that you can do here. But the key thing, let's see if I can remember where it is. I can't remember where we put this initially, but there's a place where you go, in front of me, labeled versions. So let's say that I, changed something about the code of the web package, and I changed something about the config of the data package, right? So I come in here and I make my versioning changes in ServiceFabric. We have this multiple hierarchy of types and versions and things like that. You hit save, and then you would publish this. I'm not going to do it now, but you would do that deployment. Basically, what it does is starts a rolling upgrade through your cluster where ServiceFabric has done a delta. We know what things you changed, and we know what things you didn't change. And we roll out the changed packages to the cluster in this fashion, where we go upgrade domain by upgrade domain. We drain out the existing workloads. We shut them down. We start up the new code, and we move the workloads back, right? And when that is all, a lot of those policy things that you saw in the upgrade were how long do you wait for things to stabilize? If there's an error, how long do you back off and wait to check again? What percentage of the cluster has to be unhealthy, or what percentage of the services have to be unhealthy in order to consider that a failure? All those types of policies are baked in there, and ServiceFabric, follows those instructions and kind of ploddingly, methodically, automatically goes through the cluster, moving things to the new code and configure whatever your change actually included, and watching for those types of errors. And then if any of those errors occur and don't stabilize, rolling back to the prior configuration. So it's that integration with the life cycle of the service, the knowledge, the health checks that the service is going through, and those health policies that really enable us to, as gracefully and as non-disruptively as possible, roll things through the cluster. And generally, when things are working well, those upgrades go pretty smoothly. It's a lot of those checks and policies are for when things don't go well, right? They're for what happens when errors don't clear up or stay there and don't stabilize and things like that. They're for situations where the cluster is already in some bad state and you need to push an upgrade through anyway in order to fix it. So a lot of those knobs and tools and policies are already there. You won't necessarily use them in your local dev environment, but you sure will use them in production sooner or later. And that's, again, part of the thing that ServiceFabric is bringing is all of these years of running services inside of Microsoft. We've seen some stuff. We've seen some weird things happen. And we've already got the knobs and the policies and the tools baked into the platform. You're not going to have to use them until those situations arise, but they do exist. And one thing I'll say is that zero downtime is almost never totally true. For a single service instance, you're always going to have the moment where it shuts down and then there's time before it comes back. You can achieve zero downtime through things like, message delivery, message buses, load balancers, buffering up our batching requests, handling transient failures via some library like Poly, things like that. For a single instance, there's always going to be a blip because we almost always have to shut down the code, right? If you're changing the code, we got to kill the process and bring it back. But what you're looking for is zero perceived downtime by the client, by whatever is calling into those services, and that is totally achievable. Actually, there's a really great video from Build. I think it's Build 2015. where we showed a live rolling upgrade on stage. Hanselman did the demo, but the game was Age of Ascent, which is a multiplayer online. If you've ever played Descent, which is an old Microsoft title, you can think of it as giant multiplayer Descent or EVE Online. That's built on top of ServiceFabric, and we did an upgrade where it caused an error. And we're playing the game live on stage, and ships start exploding when they shouldn't be exploding, and then it gets detected and rolled down. And so that was zero perceived downtime for the client, even though things were crashing and exploding in the background. So that's kind of what we mean when we say the marketing term is zero downtime. I say no perceivable client downtime because technically that's what you're at. So I hope that answers the question, and if there's more questions, just feel free to put another one in here. There's a question on using Visual Studio to package and publish to a ServiceFabric that is hosted on-prem. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that we see where there are problems sometimes, but it's not really ServiceFabric's domain. This is kind of a networking thing. So I would say if you can't figure out what networking thing is preventing that from working, then I would open up an issue on our GitHub Issues list, which again I'll put back up in a second, and we can help you work through it. The two major ports that ServiceFabric uses to deploy and manage the cluster are 19,000 for TCP-based communication, which is things like today are PowerShell and C# APIs, and 19,080, I believe, is everything that is HTTP as well. Those ports are also configurable, so they might not be the same in your environment, which is why I can't just say I'll go, open port 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're good. So I would say look at what those ports are currently configured as, and make sure that connectivity works between wherever you're trying to publish from and the desired environment. And if not, figure out what you need to do in order to get those. But yeah, that is a thing that we've seen. I mean, it also happens in Azure as well, where people will put NSGs on their VNets, security groups on their VNets, and lock themselves out of their cluster, and then we have to go do some surgery. Things like that. Best practices for ServiceFabric on-prem. There's actually a whole doc. If we just go to ServiceFabric docs, where we are, there's a whole doc on creating clusters on-prem, and another whole doc on kind of how to describe your cluster. And these are probably the best docs and pieces of guidance for the things that you should think about and how you should set up things like fault domains and upgrade domains and node types and all that good stuff. So I would go there. I would look through the docs. They're actually pretty good. The describe a cluster one I would like to personally promote because I wrote it. It's pretty thorough. I know it looks like a lot of information, but it's good to go through just so you understand all the concepts. Describe to do unit testing and integration with ServiceFabric. Yeah, basically it's exactly what you'd think. You can write mocks and you can inject them into your service so that you can do basic unit testing in Visual Studio without even having to deploy to the cluster. So one of the samples, which is ServiceFabric Web Reference Sample. And come on. Between a cluster and the Zoom player, my machine is chugging. And why is it wanting to log in? That's silly. Come on. Yeah, we get demos of Bing, so I need to be logged in to use Bing. Thanks, Microsoft IT. But basically, this is an example of one of those. I think that this one is still using Unity, but it is giving an example of, there's a whole bunch of mocks where I've written up a bunch of different mocks for different types that I wanted to inject, and then I can, I don't have this one cloned right now, but basically there's ways to inject, just like you'd inject other things into your web services or things like that. You can inject things into your ServiceFabric services, which, again, we're really a process activator for a lot of scenarios. And you can write these same unit tests that you'd basically always write, execute them in Visual Studio without a cluster even running, and get your unit testing that way. So not too much actually changes in terms of in terms of how you make things work.
By the way, Matt, there is also a community project called ServiceFabric Box, which is
I should
available
probably go contribute some of my code
on NuGet, which you can download. And
yeah,
for example, we run the integration test directly inside the cluster.
right. I mean, usually you want to get to that level of testing as well. And I typically see it as I'm going to test my business logic in unit tests so that I know that things are working. Like if I added 2 and 2, I got 4, and I can validate that business logic makes sense. I don't need to be running the cluster to make sure that my algorithms work, right? But I do need to be running the cluster to be sure that my algorithms work in spite of failures and chaos. And so that's something that usually the unit testing is not going to get you directly inside of VS. Typically, you're going to deploy to a local or remote cluster, and as you said, do integration testing and other testing there as well. So that's part of the progression. If your algorithms don't work in a unit test where you add 2 and 2 and get 5, then they're not going to work, in that distributed environment with all the failures either. So it's kind of a progression. But yeah, absolutely, you need all of these. In fact, we also see the chaos stuff. Part of the whole reason that we shipped a chaos service is that you can run it in production. You can be injecting a low-level amount of chaos into the cluster, and that is going to respect those. It's going to respect those types of health limits, so that if the cluster is already unhealthy, it's not going to make things worse. That's one of those things that really where the integration starts to make sense, and we're having all these different types of environments where you go from dev to integrate to pre-prod or load testing or whatever, and then to production. That pipeline really starts to make sense. How's that going to manifest itself? That's the interesting question, is how much IaaS can we take away and still preserve the power and the flexibility of the platform? And it's not like today's offering is going to go away, right? I mean, it's going to be there forever. It's just that there are some customers who do not need to, say, muck with VM extensions or configure the registry or touch the operating system because they want to apply particular patches, things like that. And so for those customers who really just want the managed experience of, I wrote this application like I have here and I just want to deploy it somewhere, but I don't want to have to really manage that environment, what can we give them, and what power or flexibility do you lose? Another thing that we're trying to think about is, how would a customer change between these types of environments? So say you had a cluster today and you wanted to come to the managed environment. How would that work? How would that transition be possible? Can we take over an existing cluster and make it managed for you and leave some of the IaaS parts, but take some of the management work away? All of this is still in flux, which is why that's a futures thing. Again, we'd be crazy not to be thinking about it, but we don't have a solid timeline or anything like that about what features are going to light up in which categories, what even the categories are going to be, when they're going to show up, all that good stuff. I mean, but it is one of those things where we'd appreciate, knowing, like, maybe you don't mind losing node types, right? Maybe all you really care about is that these two workloads can't run next to each other, right? A lot of people have to use node types and node properties and deploy all this stuff in order to configure that today, but maybe that should just be a policy that you can set and then be done, right? And you don't really care otherwise. But some people, that's not good enough, right? I have to configure lots of specific things about the firewall. I have to I care deeply about the configuration of the operating system, things like that. And so for those customers, that PASI fully managed offering isn't going to work for them, ever. And that's fine. We expect to have customers in all of these states for the foreseeable future. The question is, again, how much can we really do to remove that complexity from those who don't want to see it? So I hope that made some sense. It's in flux, and we'd love to hear your feedback, is the short version. Can you demonstrate guest executables? I might be able to. If I just go File, New, Project, and my cluster doesn't explode.
Or should we just forward to the ServiceFabric getting started example, because this demo has a guest executable build?
Yeah. They all, the getting started, actually, you're right. Fine. I was going to do it live. because I'm scary like that.
Yeah, but we're approaching an hour, so yeah.
Sorry, fine.
It's okay.
No fun. All right. So here's the ServiceFabric or the Azure code samples just generally. If you come here and you select ServiceFabric, there's actually, so the quick start was what we were looking at. That's the voting application. And then where is getting started? There it is, right in front. The getting started sample, which I actually think I might have cloned on this machine. Yeah. This has all sorts of things. This is kind of one of everything. So you get actors, you get reliable services, you get, I think there's a container one in here that we might have moved that out specifically into the getting started or into a container specific one. But I've got the actors, I got stateful services, I got stateless services, I got stateless backends, I've got web services. I think at least one of these is a guest. I haven't poked around here lately. And that one looks like a real service. But the whole point is that there's, there used to be a guest XE specific one. 2 guest executables. Yeah, okay, so we can also deploy containers as guests, which is really confusing. But the whole point is that all of these can run basically in the same, I might be stamping on a port here, but we'll see. I'll just deploy this. The whole point of ServiceFabric is that all this stuff can run basically anything. So whether it's a container or, oh, there it is, guest application exists. So it's file new project, and then you can select guest XE. What you basically end up with is a either you can point, I think, at an existing XE, or you just get a console app and you can do whatever you want. In that mode, you don't get access to some of the ServiceFabric APIs, right? The collections aren't going to be there. Some of the service lifecycle stuff isn't going to be there. But you do get the majority of the platform in terms of management, which is what a lot of people care about, right? We see actually lots of customers coming with guest XEs, modeled as stateless services that they just want some basic way to monitor and upgrade and scale. And that's a great start. And there's lots of value in that, just in monitored, upgrade, and rollback. Let's see how many, let's try to do a lightning round, see how many more of these we can try and get through here. Is it possibility to set resource availability in the local cluster? Yeah, the local cluster has the notion of load metrics and capacities. So if you, again, I love the docs. Go over to, so actually I think it's right here. So you can say every node type has a certain capacity, and you can set those capacities, and then you can select for those capacities and say that those resources are consumed when you're creating services. So that is totally doable and is very required for a whole bunch of different scenarios. I'm going to download the ServiceFabric SDK to come with orchestration infrastructure. Can I deploy it in production environments? Yeah, I mean, everything is the same. Like this, the thing that you download locally is the real runtime. It's not an emulator. It's not a simulator. It's not a constrained environment. You basically, the local environment is exactly the same, and you can deploy from your local environment to production environments. So yeah, it's all there. We don't have special versions. We don't have licensing costs. We don't have different tiers. None of that stuff. You get the full platform. Debug live running ServiceFabric instances from ? I don't know what the last noun is, so it's a little hard. You can debug clusters from Visual Studio. There's a Cloud Explorer that you get. So you can attach the debugger to a live running service in a live cluster. I wouldn't normally do that in production, but you can. And as you saw, I was debugging a local service that was on my cluster, that was deployed on my local cluster on my laptop. So you can basically debug it. I mean, that's more of a Visual Studio thing where the remote debugger works. And that follows for ServiceFabric services as well. So hopefully that answers your question. What is the cost of ServiceFabric? When is the cost of ServiceFabric going to reduce? Well, ServiceFabric itself is free right now, completely, even in Azure. So if you grab it and deploy it on-prem, that's free. If you deploy it on AWS, that's free. If you deploy it on Azure, that's free. So maybe you can give me a little bit more information about what costs you're concerned about or where those costs are coming from, and I might be able to give you a better answer. But ServiceFabric itself is free. My current ASP.NET are 5s, yeah, and not using Kestrel or Core. Yeah, so if you're stuck in, like, I suppose that this is like ASP.NET MVC 5 or something like that. Those are a little bit harder because they're not good at being self-hosted, whereas ServiceFabric, since it's the process orchestrator manager, really wants to control the lifecycle of your services. So what we normally see people do if they can't migrate to .NET Core or some sort of self-hosted model is that you take the entire IaaS deployment that you have today, you containerize it, and you deploy that container via ServiceFabric. We actually have a few big customers whose names I can't use, unfortunately, yet, who are doing exactly that. They wanted to get out of their data centers. They wanted to get to a cloud model. They couldn't rewrite everything, and they needed that scale and control. And so what they did was they containerized it and threw the container in ServiceFabric and said, "Hey, manage this." And overall, that works pretty well. It's not ideal, right? I don't like all the overhead that they have to incur in terms of, you don't get as much density out of containers as you do just bare processes, but that is an option and it does work quite well. So hopefully that answers your question, or at least gives you a couple of routes forward. All right, we did it. Clear.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
No problem.
Well, we had a few questions what the next webinar will be. So in the next webinar, Bob and I will be talking about hosting and service bus inside stateless services and stateful services. We will also show how you can access reliable connections inside handlers and what you have to do in terms of routing so that you can make sure that the messages end up on the right stateful partition. That will all be part of the next webinar. That's going to happen on the 2nd November. So if you're registered for this webinar series, you'll be automatically transitioned to the next webinar as soon as this one is over, and you'll get the usual reminders via email. And thanks, Matt, for doing this presentation. The webinar is recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording links to all the people that are registered for the webinar. So the ones who didn't have a chance to attend it live, they can then listen to you talking at home. And yeah, if you have anything to say as a closing up, Matt, it's your time.
Well, no, I thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about ServiceFabric. I love this stuff. I think it's very useful, and I won't miss the opportunity to say, join us in the monthly Q&As on ServiceFabric. If you have more questions or want to know anything about the platform, you can duck in there, and we're always available on GitHub. I should have, oh darn, I forgot to we have a Slack channel as well. I forgot to add the information for that in here, but I will do that as well. But thanks again for the opportunity, and I look forward to the next webinar.
Cool, thanks. Have a great evening or morning, depending on your time zone.
Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.